Hi folks, welcome to Lesson 5 of Unit 2 of the Higher Human Biology course. Lesson 5 is all about the structure and function of arteries, capillaries and veins. Now before we start this, it's worth saying that if you've done National 5 Biology before, you'll already know the basics of these three different types of blood vessels. But in the Higher Human Biology course, we go into each of them in just a little bit more detail, okay? So there'll be some familiarity, but there'll also be quite a lot of new stuff for you to learn here too. So the first thing to know about this topic is to state that blood circulates from the heart through the arteries to the capillaries to the veins. So the arteries to the capillaries to the veins and then back to the heart. Okay, so we've got a circulatory system. Okay, it goes round, it leaves the heart, goes via the arteries to the capillaries, the veins, and then back to the heart. And we know it's a double circulatory system, which means it leaves via the aorta to go to the body. But then when it comes back into the heart, it leaves the second time via the pulmonary artery to go to the lungs. So it goes to a different location on that second loop as part of that double circulatory system. Now, the thing that you need to know about circulation of blood is that the blood pressure, that's the pressure that the blood exerts on the walls of the blood vessel, that will decrease as the blood moves away from the heart. And this diagram here, this graph, is a really good illustration of that. And we can see within the aorta and the arteries that follow, we can see the blood pressure is extremely high. And then as it starts to enter the smaller blood vessels, first of all, the arterioles, which you don't need to know about, then onto the capillaries, we can see how much of a drop there has been in blood pressure. It's quite a dramatic drop. And then obviously by the time we get to the veins and the vena cava, which of course returns blood into the heart, we can see that the blood pressure is almost down to zero. So it's worth noting that huge drop, that huge decrease in blood pressure as blood moves away from the heart. So we need to know about the three blood vessels. Now, the two that are probably the easiest to kick off with and to sort of compare are the arteries and veins. And you'll remember this from Nat 5 because they share a lot of similarities, but they have small differences within those similarities. So the first thing that both of them have, but we'll focus on the arteries for now, is they have an endothelium. Okay, and that endothelium lines the central lumen of the blood vessels. Okay, and then that endothelium is then surrounded by layers of other tissue, which we'll talk about in a moment. So if we look at our diagram here, we can see an artery at the bottom. We've got our lumen in here in the middle. Surrounding that lumen, we've got our endothelium. Surrounding that, we've got our smooth muscle, which contains elastic fibers. And then we've got our connective tissue on the outside, which also contains elastic fibers. Okay, so the arteries have an outer layer of connective tissue, which contains the elastic fibers. We can see that on the outside here of the artery. It has a middle layer that contains smooth muscle and it has more elastic fibers. Okay, and we can see the smooth muscle and the extra elastic fibers in the middle there. Okay, now both of those outer layers, both the smooth muscle and the connective tissue, contain elastic fibers, so it's worth remembering that. Okay, so that's the structure of the artery. Now, the artery's job is to take blood away from the heart at very high pressures. As a result, the arteries need to have some sort of a degree of flexibility, okay? And so the elastic walls that they have within the connective tissue and the smooth muscle layer, it allows the arteries to stretch and to recoil. Those terms are worth committing to memory because they're a nice way to describe why the walls of the artery are elastic. And the reason they have to stretch and recoil is to accommodate the surge of blood after each contraction of the heart. When the heart pumps and it contracts, it forces blood out of the heart at very high pressures, and that puts tremendous pressure on the walls of the artery. So that ability to stretch and then recoil allows it to withstand that pressure, but then also retain its original shape. Okay, it can recoil back in to its original configuration. Now that smooth muscle that we find in the central layer of the artery, the smooth muscle, that can either contract or relax. Okay, and we use two terms to describe the contraction or relaxation of the smooth muscle. The first one is vasoconstriction. Okay, constriction, contract. Okay, that's the way to remember it. Con, vasoconstriction, contract. We've also got vasodilation, which means to relax. Okay, and we'll use that term dilation or similar derivatives of that name throughout the course to mean to relax. Okay, and what vasoconstriction and vasodilation do is they control blood flow. Okay, they control the flow of blood through our blood vessels. Now, how do they do that? Because this is what you might be asked in the exam. Well, we can see from our diagram here that vasoconstriction reduces blood flow. How does it do that? Well, it becomes much narrower, okay? And we'll go back to vasoconstriction in a second. Okay, so vasoconstriction, you see it's much narrower, it reduces blood flow, but when it reduces blood flow, as a result, it increases blood pressure, okay? So vasoconstriction is good to reduce blood flow, but it's bad in terms of it increasing the blood pressure because we don't want that to increase by too much. Vasodilation, on the other hand, because it becomes much wider, it dilates, will increase blood flow and as a result, decrease the blood pressure, okay? And a lot of these medications that people take to deal with high blood pressure, with a very high blood pressure, is a vasodilating medicine, which basically means it widens those arteries, which means it reduces the pressure on the walls of the artery. Okay, so that's vasoconstriction, reduces blood flow. Vasodilation increases blood flow by widening that central lumen. Okay, hope that makes sense. You need to remember those, the key terms, stretch and recoil. That's why they've got elastic walls. And vasoconstriction and dilation, that's where the smooth muscle this time is able to contract or relax to either reduce or increase blood flow. Now, let's look at the other half of the blood vessels. Let's look at the veins, okay? Now, arteries and veins, I said earlier on, they go together a lot because they have a lot of similar features. So the veins also have connective tissue on the outside, just like the arteries. And they also contain elastic fibers. Now, as you would imagine, these are not as important in a vein because the pressure of the blood traveling through the vein is so much lower than it is in the artery. And as a result, because they don't need to vasoconstrict or vasodilate, they have a much thinner muscular wall, okay? And it's important to use comparative statements when you're describing the veins and the arteries. So we say it's got a thinner muscular wall. The artery has got a thicker, more muscular wall, but the vein has a thinner, but still muscular wall than the arteries, okay? And we can see that we've got the smooth connective tissue. We've got the connective tissue on the outside, we've got the smooth muscle in there, then we've got the endothelium. And the other thing that veins have, which are so important to allow them to function, is valves, okay? And the job, as we know from that 5, of valves is to prevent this backflow of blood, okay? Because we want the blood to continue to move in one direction back towards the heart. So preventing that backflow is essential because the pressure of the blood is much lower within the vein. Now, the third blood vessel we need to know about for this topic is the capillaries. Now, we didn't go into much detail about the capillaries in all honesty at Nat 5, but we're going to go into what happens within the capillaries in more detail for the higher human biology course. So capillaries have got a key job. They allow the exchange of substances within tissues. Okay, so tissues are made up of a multitude of cells, okay? Cells make up tissues. So in order to supply those cells within the tissues with the things that they need, the glucose, the amino acids, the oxygen, we need a extensive blood supply, a capillary network, we call it, that surrounds those tissues and allows easy access for nutrients and gases to go into the cells. But similarly, to allow the waste products of those cells to go back into the blood. So when the blood arrives at a capillary bed, okay, and we can see that in this diagram here, and we can see it in this diagram up here as well. Okay, when the blood arrives at the capillary bed, the pressure is going to be quite high. Okay, why is it high? Because it's come from the arteries. Okay, blood entering the capillary bed has come from an artery, so the pressure's high. Now, because of this higher pressure, it will force some of the plasma that's in the blood out through the thin walls of the capillaries. Okay, remember, the capillaries have got extremely thin walls, usually 1 cell thick. So that plasma is going to be forced through by this pressure, those thin walls of the capillary bed, and they get forced out into this space here. Okay, these spaces here are known as the tissue fluid. And the process which forces the plasma through is called pressure filtration. Okay, so we can see the blood arrives here and the plasma within the blood, because it's under such high pressure, gets forced through the thin walls of the capillaries, and the plasma then enters the tissue fluid, which we can see bathing and surrounding these cells here. Okay, see the tissue fluid surrounding these cells here as well. Okay, now the tissue fluid, which surrounds the cells, and the blood plasma, which is obviously in the blood, they are very similar in composition. So the things which are inside of both of them are very similar, with one notable exception that you do need to know about for the exam because they do ask this a lot. And that exception is that there's plasma proteins, obviously found in the plasma, but they are too large to be able to be filtered through the capillary walls, okay? So even with pressure filtration, we cannot force those proteins into the tissue fluid. So the tissue fluid lacks those plasma proteins, whereas the plasma has those plasma proteins. And you need to know about that difference in terms of the composition for your exam. Now, tissue fluid is so important. This surrounds our cells, it bathes our cells, and it allows us to be able to exchange gases and nutrients and so on very easily between our blood vessels, our capillaries, and the cells, okay? So the capillaries and the cells are able to exchange materials. Now, the tissue fluid supplies lots of things to the cells, but the most important ones that we know about are glucose and oxygen, which are obviously needed for aerobic respiration, but other substances as well, like amino acids for protein synthesis, or fatty acids and glycerol, which we get from the breakdown of fats. All of these things need to be supplied to cells, and the tissue fluid acts as that medium between the capillaries and the cells to allow that exchange to happen. Now, the cells don't just take in substances, they also give out waste products, and those include carbon dioxide as well as other metabolic wastes. And those wastes are then able to diffuse out of the cell and into the tissue fluid so that they can be excreted. And if we take carbon dioxide as an example, that will leave those tissue cells and they will go into our veins here, okay? Leave the cells and diffuse into the veins, leave the cells and diffuse into the veins here. And the veins will then return those metabolic wastes, that carbon dioxide, back to a part of the body that can excrete it. So, for example, carbon dioxide will be excreted via the lungs. Something like urea will be excreted via the kidneys and the bladder. Okay. So we can get rid of those wastes as well. However, much of the tissue fluid, that's the fluid that surrounds these cells, returns to the blood. Okay. Most of it returns to the blood. However, in circumstances where we have excess tissue fluid, okay, for whatever reason, the pressure filtration of the plasma becomes too much and the tissue fluid builds up, we can absorb any excess tissue fluid through these lymphatic vessels. You can see this green vessel in the diagram is a lymphatic vessel, and you can see it's all connected to the tissue fluid, so it can absorb that excess tissue fluid and remove it and take it away from the surrounding the cells. And what it then does is it will return this tissue fluid, which is now known as lymph fluid because it's in the lymph vessel, and it will take that then back to the circulatory system at another point in the body. Okay, there's a lot of other points in the body where the lymphatic system and the circulatory system come close together, and that lymph fluid that can then be returned to the blood at that point. Okay, so and again, you need to know about those lymphatic vessels. That question comes up a lot. So what they do is absorb the excess tissue fluid and return that lymph fluid as it becomes to the circulatory system. You need to know that last wee bit. Okay, folks, so that's the end of the PowerPoint part of this lesson. We're going to have a look at a couple of past paper questions and see how you got on with them. Okay, so let's look at the past paper questions for the topic on the arteries, capillaries and veins. So this one says, which of these cross sections through a blood vessel represents a vein? Okay, so if we remember the features of the vein, well, it's got a wide lumen, okay? It's got a wider lumen, so that's going to probably be this one or this one. These both have a wide lumen, don't they? Okay, whereas B and D have very narrow lumens, so they look more like arteries than veins. The other feature that we look for, we'll look at the key here, and it's got the muscle tissue in black. Now, if we remember from the structure of both the arteries and the veins, this smooth muscle is in the middle here, okay? And it's on the outside for A, which means that it's not going to be A. We have connective tissue on the outside and smooth muscle inside, so A can't be right. So therefore, our answer must be C, okay? So we've got our connective tissue there, we've got our smooth muscle there, and we've got our endothelium there. Okay, and we've got obviously the much wider central lumen in the middle of the vein there. So our answer is going to be C for that one. Number 12, we've got a diagram that represents a section through an artery this time. Which label correctly identifies a region containing smooth muscle tissue? So hopefully we remember that A is the connective tissue on the outside with elastic fibers. That B in the middle here is the smooth muscle layer, which also contains elastic fibers. So that's going to be our answer. C is the endothelium that surrounds D, which is the central lumen. Okay. And we can see the diameter of that central lumen there. Then the endothelium, the smooth muscle, and the connective tissue. You need to know those layers for our blood vessels because this, as you can see from the couple we've looked at, is a common question in the exam. Number 10 shows a blood vessel. Which of the following is structure X? Okay. So X is pointing to this layer here. Okay, just outside the lumen. Okay, this is the central lumen. It's this layer here. This next layer, hopefully we know by now, is the smooth muscle. And this outside layer here is the connective tissue. So connective tissue, smooth muscle. So X must be pointing to the endothelium. So that's going to be A for that one. Number 11, which of the following descriptions descriptions is correct for arteries and veins? So let's have a look at arteries first. They have a relatively narrow lumen. Well, that's true for arteries. They have a thick layer of smooth muscle. Again, true. Few elastic fibers. That's not going to be true for arteries because they need the elastic fibers so that they can stretch and recoil due to the high pressure of the blood. So it's not going to be C. They have a relatively wide lumen. Well, again, we know that's not true because it's the vein that has the relatively wide lumen. Okay, so we know it's not going to be C or D. We may as well score all of these out so we don't get confused. Okay, so it's going to be A or B based on the arteries. If we look at the vein descriptions, the vein has a thin layer of smooth muscle. Well, it does. The vein does have smooth muscle. It doesn't have as much as the artery, but it has a thinner layer of smooth muscle. Okay, and actually that description should probably say thinner. And then the part number B here says no valves are present, right? We know that the key characteristic of a vein is that it has valves, okay? So it's not going to be B there, which means we can eliminate that answer. And the only one with two correct descriptions is A. Okay, number 11, which of the following is not correct? Tissue fluid mostly ends up in capillaries. I'm not sure about that one, but we'll come back to it. It returns to the capillaries by osmosis and diffusion. That is going to be true. Okay, most of the tissue fluid does return to the capillaries. Allows the exchange of materials between cells in the blood. Yep, that's one of its key functions. That's its main priority. And D is forced out under pressure from capillaries and bathes the body cells. That's also true. That's pressure filtration, which forces it out and then surrounds and bathes our body cells. So D is going to be true. Now, the only one that I wasn't sure about was A, okay, and that is the one that's not correct. The tissue fluid does not mostly end up in capillaries, okay? It's the other way around where it goes from the capillaries to the tissue fluid. Okay, let's have a look at a couple of section 2 questions on this topic. So it says here the diagram shows some of the blood vessels within the muscle tissue of an athlete. The direction of blood flow is indicated by the arrows. Name the type of blood vessels labelled X and Y. Okay, so X is going to be the blood vessel that's taking blood into the capillary bed towards it. So that's going to be our artery. Okay, that's going to be the artery. And Y, where's Y? Y is here pointing to the capillary bed, okay? So we'll say capillary bed. You could probably just say capillary and get the mark there, okay? But it is a capillary bed or a capillary network or something similar. Part B, name two substances which are at a higher concentration at point P, than point S. Okay, so point P is up here in the artery and point S is down here in the vein. So what's going to be in a higher concentration in an artery compared with a vein is essentially what it's asking us. So in our arteries, hopefully we will have things like oxygen, and that will be in a high concentration because the cells in the capillary bed are bathed by that tissue fluid. They're going to need oxygen. They're also going to need glucose. Now, we know that we need those two things for aerobic respiration. You could also say something like amino acids, which our cells are going to need for protein synthesis, or fatty acids and glycerol, which of course are the breakdown product of fats. Okay, so anything along those lines would get you the mark for that question there. If we go into part C, An athlete ran a treadmill at high speed for 10 minutes. Explain why the concentration of lactic acid in his blood increased during this time, right? This is really more a unit 1 question, but we'll just quickly answer it anyway. Why would lactic acid in the blood increase during this time? Because the cells are lacking oxygen, okay? Or not getting enough oxygen or something along those lines. That would get you the mark there. Tissue fluid surrounds the muscle cells. Some of this fluid is reabsorbed into the bloodstream. How else is tissue fluid removed from around the muscle cells? Okay. And this was the sentence I told you to memorize earlier on, which is that excess tissue fluid is absorbed by the lymphatic. Misspelt that, lymphatic vessels, and returned, and I should say the lymph fluid as it becomes, as soon as it goes into the lymphatic vessel, it becomes lymph fluid, and the lymph fluid is returned, help if you could spell, Mr. White, to the circulatory system. Okay, and it's usually another location within the body. Okay, you can see it's not just you guys that can't spell. Mr. White can't do it either. Okay, number 7, we'll have a wee go at this before we finish up. It says the diagram shows a section through an artery. Name the parts of the artery labelled Y and Z. Okay, so let's have a look at this together. So Y is pointing to, this is the central lumen, okay? You get away with just saying lumen there, I would imagine, and get the mark in the exam, but I'll just pop in central lumen because it's nice just to be as accurate as we can. And I think that's the key to biology when you're answering questions. Try and answer the questions with the most specificity and accuracy as you can, because that's what's going to be able to get you the marks, okay? So Y is the central lumen. Z is the next layer out from the central lumen. And hopefully by now we know that the central lumen is surrounded by the endothelium, okay? We don't know that. Have a look over that until you can memorize it. Layer X there is our smooth muscle, which also contains elastic fibers. And layer W on the very outside is our connective tissue, which also contains elastic fibers. Let's look at the next question. It says layer X contains elastic fibers. Okay, just what I've said. Name one other type of tissue found in layer X. So layer X contains our smooth muscle. Okay, and that's what they're looking for that answer there. And lastly, describe the role of the elastic fibers in the wall of the artery, okay? Elastic fibers allow the artery to stretch and recoil. That's the key term, stretch and recoil, due to high pressures of blood. Okay, so it allows the artery to stretch and recoil. That's the key thing to make sure you put in your answer there, folks. Okay, so hopefully that's helped doing those questions on top of the little lesson that we had, and I hope that you've learned a lot on this topic and you're feeling a bit more confident about it now. But that's all for now, folks. I'll see you in the next one. Class dismissed.